Hi, everyone. Sorry for the delays. This is our first time doing a live stream with Zoom, so thanks for your patience with us. Um, we're going to go ahead and get started with our first guest with Body Politic on our live series. Just want to say right at the beginning, the information in this webinar is for information purposes only and not intended for medical advice for any medical conditions. So, our expert that's joining us today is Dr. Julie Hill. She earned her master's degree in career counseling and her PhD in counselor education with an emphasis in rehabilitation. Her dissertation focused on career transitions caused by chronic illness. She's an assistant professor in the Clinical Rehabilitation Counseling program at Auburn University. Her research focuses on quality of life, coping, adaptation, and adjustment to chronic illness and disability, as well as career development, career transitions, and employment concerns for individuals living with chronic illness and disabilities. In addition to these areas, Dr. Hill has knowledge and experience with work and school accommodations due to disability and chronic illness. She also lives with multiple chronic illnesses herself. Dr. Hill, do you want to join us? Hello.
Oh, thank you for having me today.
I'm so happy to have you. So, could you just start off by talking generally about your work and how it can apply to people who have fluctuating recoveries from COVID or long COVID?
Sure. So, there is quite a bit of research out there about the process of adapting and adjusting to disability and chronic illness, but I want to say that it is definitely not a one time occurrence. It's a process that happens over and over again across the course of the lifetime, just like adapting and adjusting to any sort of illness or disability. You're going to go through highs and lows, and it's all about kind of finding what your new normal is going to be. It's definitely not something anyone should go through alone, which is why groups like this are so important for finding support and advocacy efforts. But I think the biggest takeaway from my research and from what I've seen is that it's always important to have support as well as hope. And that is kind of the overarching message of what I try to do in my research is find ways to help people adjust, adapt, find their new normal, and have the best quality of life possible, even with barriers, limitations, things like that are presented by living with long term chronic illnesses.
Could you start talking generally, like, how do you recommend patients who are going through this transition in the beginning phases of their chronic illness or disability, in this case, long COVID, how, how do you recommend like that they work on their coping mechanisms? How do you start this transition?
So, for anyone that's familiar with the stages of grief, that's an important thing to understand. It's not just in relation to death or the loss of a loved one or an important member, it can be the loss of your life as you knew it. And so, the stages of grief, the first stage is denial. So, a lot of people are probably like, no, this isn't happening to me. This isn't going to last forever. This happens to other people, not me. And so that's perfectly normal to be in denial in the beginning that this isn't going to affect you for the rest of your life. The next stage is anger. So that's also completely normal to be angry and upset that this happened to you, because it's not something anyone, just like with any chronic illness, it's not something that anyone asked for. No one deserves this diagnosis. No one deserves to live with this. And so it's perfectly okay. And I think we need to normalize that anger is going to happen. Like you're going to be mad, you're going to be sad, you're going to feel your feelings, and it's important not to shove those down and to feel them. Then we move into bargaining, which is, if I just do this, then things will be better. Depression. So again, once it kind of sinks in that this is going to be your life from now on, it's also normal to be sad, even depressed. Some of those anger may feel pop up again. But then the final stage is acceptance, which is understanding that this is your life from now on. But that acceptance comes with, I like to think, hope, finding what works for you, finding your support system, finding your new normal. We see something in the research called a value shift. And so things that maybe used to be very important to you kind of take a backseat, and you learn to find the things that make you happy and give you meaning, purpose, fulfillment, whatever that may be. So it may be, let's say you were super active and outdoorsy before and you went camping every weekend and hiking. Well, that's maybe not going to happen anymore, but you find new things to fill that void that may have appeared. And so it might be getting really in, it might be going back to school. It might be finding starting a YouTube channel or a blog, or finding ways to reach other people like you, really getting into good books, or whatever it is that still helps you fill a void in your life that may be left by things you can't do anymore, but finding those things you can do and focusing on what you can do and not so much what you can't do.
I think that's a really, I just love everything that you just said. And I personally identify with that in the process that I've gone through in the last 6 years of living with post-viral ME/CFS. Could you just talk for a minute about, I think one of the hard parts about being a long COVID patient right now is we don't know what their future is going to look like. Like they could get back to normal. Absolutely, that could happen. And so they're like, well, I don't know if I want to accept yet that this is how my life is going to be because it might not be permanent. Do you have any tips for living with that uncertainty?
I think it's important to live in the now and not in the future, because none of us know what's going to happen, no matter the illness. I mean, I would love to hope that they're going to come up with cures for everything someday, but we just don't know. And it can be damaging to your mental health and your physical health to put things on hold and just wait and see what happens. It's important to have that hope that yes, maybe things will change, but you also need to learn to live in the present and learn to live in your current whatever state that is going to be. And so finding joy, finding happiness in whatever brings you those feelings right now. So hold out hope for the future that things will change, but learn to accept what life currently looks like and whatever that may look like for you, finding things that make you happy right
I love that. These answers are
now.
awesome. Okay, so let's jump into talking about employment transitions because I know that's like really the area that you focus on in your career. Can you just start us off by talking generally, like what do you do as a rehabilitation counselor and how can you help with employment transitions?
So I would say for anybody experiencing the loss of a career or having to switch or even just navigating accommodations, it can be really useful to talk to a vocational rehabilitation counselor. And everyone is entitled to those services for free because of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So whatever state you're living in, if you want to, you can just Google vocational rehabilitation services, and you should be able to find an office near you. That those people are there to help navigate these transitions. So they can do different types of assessments to find out what your skill level is. They can help you go back to school if that, or a training program if that's something that would be of interest to you or applicable. Or they can even just talk you through the process of asking for accommodations and help you understand what your rights under the law are. You're never asked to disclose specifics about your condition. You generally do have to disclose that you have some sort of medical condition, chronic illness, or disability that qualifies you to receive accommodations, but no one should ever ask for specifics more than you're willing to disclose. If you want to disclose everything, you can, but they can also help talk you through that process of what you're entitled to, how to have those conversations. And again, those services are completely free to you. It's a right, and it's part of the federal vocational rehabilitation system.
And I just want to make a note here from my experience using services like that, that it's okay if the experts that you find, the vocational rehabilitation person that you meet with, it's okay if they've never heard of long COVID, right? They know how to work around a variety of disabilities and other um, and medical conditions. And so it's okay if they've not heard of long COVID because they can still use their knowledge to help patients, right?
Right. The important thing they're going to be looking for are what are your barriers to employment and how can they reduce those barriers. And so that's essentially what an accommodation does. If you've ever looked at a job description, it says you must meet the essential functions of the job. And it may say it, but it's implied with or without accommodations. So let's say that trying to think of one off the top of my head. Let's say that you have fine motor issues. And so typing is something that's going to be an issue for you, but the job requires a lot of that. Well, the employer would provide dictation software like Dragon Naturally Speaking so that you could speak instead of having to type. So you're still meeting the essential functions of the job. You're just doing it in a different way than what might be typical.
That makes sense. Okay, so let's just start diving into like a couple of questions that I saw come up in the group, and I think that these can help start some longer conversations between us. Um, so one of the first questions I want to ask is, how would you advise those of us who can't function at the same level as we were previous to COVID? How would you advise them to plan for a potential career change? And then they said, though there must be many more facets, I see two main ones: the psychological aspects, i.e., coping of having to give up a passion, a career, colleagues, etc., and also, and how to go about finding a new meaning, identity, and a fulfilling job activity. That is, if we have enough energy to pursue one.
Right. Well, and that's a really great question, and one that a lot of people face, regardless of whether it's long COVID or not, is the onset, because a lot of chronic illnesses happen in people's early 20s, which is right when you're starting to figure out what you want to do with your life. And so I think it's important to have access to quality mental health care. So therapists, counselors, people like that can help you navigate. I know for me, what I've done with working with this population before is cognitive behavioral therapy is really helpful in helping you reframe things. It's not never going to fix the problem, but it helps the way that you approach and think about the problem. So I would recommend anybody that is struggling with this or dealing with this to find a good counselor or a therapist. And something that's important to know is you don't always have to go with the first person that you find. It needs to be a good fit between the client and the counselor. And so not everybody has the same skill set. And so you want to find the person that works best for you. So don't be afraid to fire somebody if you need to. And then I would say, and this is based on my own experience of having to leave a job that I loved. I was in my mid 20s when I was diagnosed with the first of my chronic illnesses, and it led to the end of my career. My degree was no longer useful, and I remember thinking, what on earth am I going to do now? And luckily, I had a good therapist, and I switched gears, went back to school, and found something that I never thought that I would be good at or even remotely interested in. And it's turned into a very fulfilling career. So I would say be okay with thinking outside the box, and don't be afraid to ask for help. Sometimes we get so stuck in this is what I was supposed to do with my life, that it can be hard to think of other options. So be willing to think outside the box, and also be willing to go ask for help. And sometimes you need a neutral third party to kind of help you process your options and think about things that maybe you hadn't thought of yourself.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. Could we talk about the interview and accommodations process? So I know that there's a lot to talk about in there, but first, in the interview phase, should you disclose that you have a medical conditions or that you will need accommodations? And then can we talk about accommodations once you're in a job?
Yes. So the whether to disclose or not, I think is going to be a very personal decision. It's going to depend on several factors. How big is the company? What do they do? Let's say it's an advocacy organization for people with chronic illness. That's probably a perfect place to disclose and might actually make you more marketable for the job. But if it's something that you're nervous about, you are under no obligation to disclose in the interview, because as long as you can meet those essential functions of the job with or without accommodations. Now, you don't want to apply for a job that you would have no capability of doing. I think that's important. Accommodations can only do so much. So I would make sure that you wait until, if you're not going to disclose in the interview, wait until you've been offered the job and accept, and then you would find out who you need to talk to. So most organizations have usually someone in human resources that handles their accommodations process. If it's a small organization, it might just be the manager. But if it's any sort of large organization with an HR department, there's probably someone in HR that handles accommodations. There's a really great resource out there called the Job Accommodation Network, and I will post the link when we're done in in the Slack channel. But it's Jan, askjan.org is the website, and it has a lot of really great resources about what are your rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act. There's even a section on how to ask for accommodations, how to request it, how to negotiate that. There's also, you can search their accommodations. So you can search by limitation, you can search by condition. They're probably not going to have COVID up there right now, but they do have like dysautonomia. I think chronic fatigue syndrome is on there. So things that are related that might give you the idea of what to ask for. That's also another question. If you're talking to a VR counselor, they can help you with. I think one benefit to the pandemic is we used to see a lot of people get turned down for requests to work remotely because they said it wasn't possible. Now we know that that's not true. We've all been doing it for months now. And so that is not going to be a very good excuse for denying accommodations anymore by saying it's not possible, because now we know that it's not only possible, but we've all been doing it for months. So I would definitely recommend going to Jan, looking at their resources. You can also even call them if you have questions, and experts on accommodations will walk you through the process.
That's amazing. Wow.
Yeah, it's a really great resource. And they have separate pages for employers. So if your employer has a question, you can direct them to Jan. Jan will talk to your employer. I think the other thing that's important to point out is that generally most accommodations don't cost a lot of money. There's kind of a myth out there that accommodations are really expensive. Most accommodations can be implemented with $20 or less. So it's really not something that is going to be very expensive. Now, obviously, if somebody had to install an elevator, let's say, that's going to be a little bit more of an expense, but maybe just put you on a ground floor office if that's. So it can seem complicated, but there's also usually a pretty simple workaround for a lot of issues that people face due to chronic illness issues.
We just had a question come in that I think is really relevant to the conversation we're having right now, which is that many of us do not actually have a diagnosis. Can work accommodations still be requested in those cases?
That's a really good question. I would say it doesn't hurt to ask, because you're still experiencing barriers and you still have a chronic illness. You may just not have a title for your chronic illness yet. So it never hurts to ask for accommodations due to an illness that you're experiencing.
So another question that we had is, um, from a long COVID patient, how can we help prospective employers understand the relapse potential of the transition while also understanding our potential value post-relapse? So I think what they're talking about is, like, let's say they get into a job, and the beginning of a job can be pretty stressful and you're learning a lot. And long COVID patients might experience a crash from that experience, and might need some time off or have a lower number of hours during that time. How can these patients convince their employers that they are still valuable and they should hang on through that crash?
So the whole kind of relapsing remitting thing is not new to COVID. We've seen that before. It's the one I think of off the top of my head is multiple sclerosis. It has a relapsing remitting course. And so while we don't know what relapsing remitting looks like for COVID yet, we do know what it looks like in other conditions. And so if you can make that parallel, and I think that's why in that interview process, you really want to highlight your strengths and highlight what you can bring to the position. And then when you go to have that conversation with your employer, remind them of, here's the things that I am still going to be really good at doing, and here's what I need to be able to do that. So whether that's working from home so that you can lay down while you're working if you need to. I think as long as your overall contribution to the company is going to outweigh your downside, I guess I don't want to say it that way, but you are going to need some help maybe. But generally, if they're willing to hire you in the first place, they've seen value in you. And so you just need to remember to highlight that. I really love working for this company. I think your mission is really great. I really enjoy my position. I may need some additional accommodations to help me do my job to the best of my ability. And here's what I need. And here is how it's going to help me remain a productive employee. So highlight your strengths, highlight what you still bring to the position, and make sure that they understand that these accommodations are simply helping you to maintain your productivity. They're not going to necessarily mean that you can't do your job. You just may need a little extra time, or you may need to do it in a little different way, but you're still getting the job done.
Thanks. That's a really great point. I just want to take a quick step back for a minute. Could you give us an example of what accommodations are for people who might be new to this space? And there's a lot of new terminology that comes with the disability and chronic illness world. And I think a lot of people might think, oh, an accommodation is, a wheelchair accessible bathroom or ramp to get into a building. And it's actually so much larger than just that.
Yeah, so accommodations could include anything from remote working or teleworking, so working from home, or having let's say, an ergonomic keyboard so that your hands don't fatigue as quickly, or using a dictation software so that you're not necessarily having to type or expend that energy to type. Or it could be having breaks at regular intervals so that you can eat or drink to keep up your energy. A lot of us have conditions that make us dehydrated rather quickly, so it's important to stay hydrated. So, or even having food and drink at your workspace, or um, maybe having a blue light filter on your computer screen so that your eyes don't get as fatigued. And again, these things are not very expensive. So it's anything that allows you to do your job. It just may look a little bit differently for people with chronic illness and disability. And so the list is pretty long, but just think about what you might need to stay productive, and that is what could be considered an accommodation. Or let's say using software to read documents out loud to you, so that you can follow along. That using software for that is going to be an accommodation. Large print so that you don't have to strain your eyes to read. Those are just some that I can think of off the top of my head, but I think it's very simple. It's just things that will help you to do your job most effectively.
I think those were great. I remember when you were talking about that, something popped in my brain of I had an accommodation when I was still working outside the home to have frequent bathroom breaks because of how often I was hydrating. I would have to go to the bathroom like at least once every hour.
Yeah. And I just pulled up Jan, and there is one for chronic fatigue. And so it goes by limitation and by work related functions. And so it has like anti glare filters for fluorescent lights, alternative lighting, apps for memory or memory software, things like that, verbal cues or written instructions, and if you're not necessarily an auditory person. So that's the great thing about this website, is you don't have to reinvent the wheel. People are there to already tell you. If you can tell them what your limitation or your barrier is, they can help you find a way around that.
That's awesome. And hopefully soon they'll have a section for long COVID. But until then, the communities that have dealt with similar barriers. So here's an interesting question for people who might be in the same work situation that they were in prior to COVID. Um, how do you advise they navigate telling their colleagues? Someone wrote in and talked about how they've been doing remote work, so their colleagues aren't necessarily aware that they had COVID, and they're worried about disclosing that because there might be some worry about like, what if they give it to me or something like that, which I know these are challenges that we faced with the HIV AIDS epidemic, right? Can you
Mhm.
talk about that a little bit?
So I would say maybe start with one person that if you have somebody that you know really well at your organization that you would feel comfortable disclosing to, and kind of try it out on them. Remember, you are also under no obligation to disclose to your coworkers. You may need to disclose to somebody in human resources if you need accommodations. If you don't need accommodations right now, and you don't feel comfortable disclosing, you're under no obligation to do so. I would say it's probably going to make it easier on your mental health if you go ahead and disclose, so that you don't have that hanging over your head. And I know I've seen you share some really great resources, Allison, about what long COVID is looking like. So I would say maybe disclosing to a trusted person, giving them some information to read so that you are not responsible for doing all of the educating, and kind of see how it goes. And if that goes well, then maybe you expand it to your boss or to your HR person or whoever that may be. But I would say start with somebody that you know and trust, and then kind of move on from there and only disclose what you feel comfortable disclosing. But I think for your overall long term well being, it's going to be important that you don't feel like you're keeping a secret from somebody, because that can be draining too, is always feeling like you have to watch what you say or watch how you say it. And it might just be easier in the long run if you go ahead and disclose and get the questions out of the way and let them see that it's not affecting your performance. It's just something that you're dealing with. And you might find that hopefully you're going to be met with empathy and support. And then if you're not, then it might be that maybe when you ask for help from a therapist or a vocational rehabilitation counselor on how to handle the situation.
I think back to I moved around a lot from job to job in the first few years of my illness because I really struggled with um I was provided accommodations, but I found that I couldn't sustain the number of hours and the type of work that I was doing. Ooh, I lost my train of thought. Well, full transparency, honesty. Oh, actually, that reminds me. Um, I ended up disclosing more than I thought I would when I was working because it was exhausting for me to try to pretend to be someone that I wasn't. And so when things like that happened where I forget what I'm doing, um, I felt like I was more accepted and more understood once I disclosed because then people would know why that would happen, you know?
Well, you may find the chronic illness community is a lot bigger than we think it is. So while someone else at your place of work may not have long COVID, maybe they have another condition and you're helping them not feel so alone. There's huge power in knowing that you're not the only one. And it doesn't even have to be the same condition. It just has to be someone else understands the experience of living with this illness that's never going to go away. I know for me, when I was this last time I was searching for jobs, I disclosed in my cover letter not what I had specifically, but I was applying for jobs as a rehabilitation counselor educator. And so I said, living with multiple chronic illnesses, most of them invisible, will help me bring an important perspective to the classroom. So they knew when they offered me an interview that I had something going on. I didn't disclose specifics, but and then they made the decision to bring me in for an interview and then I got the job. I was advised not to disclose, but I had to make that choice because for me, my chronic illnesses are a part of my identity. They are also what got me into the job that I'm in now and why I pursue the career that I did. And so for me to leave that entire chunk out of my identity was not being authentic to myself. And that's where I am at this point in my journey. Not everyone may be there yet, but to me, having chronic illness is just a part of who I am. Like I have blonde hair and blue eyes. And so I can't hide that and I don't want to hide that. So I'm very transparent. I recognize that not everybody is there yet or comfortable with that yet. So you have to find your own level of comfort and understanding for yourself. But I say it's better to disclose and get the support you need than try to hide it.
I think also this builds on the barriers that people with invisible illnesses face, right? Because long COVID is largely an invisible illness. It's not like once we go back to work in person, people are showing up, you know, with an extremely visible disability. And there are loads of other people out there who have various invisible illnesses that we might not know about. So I think I mean, for me, back to what you were saying about how this is where you are in your process, that you're very transparent, you are very open. It took me um quite a while of time before. I really had understood what was going on with me. I needed to understand from doctors what was going on with me, like what my correct diagnosis was, what kind of like my prognosis was before I was really able to be empowered and be able to say, yes, this is part of who I am, and I'd like to disclose this in my professional life. And it's a process that takes time.
Right. And so maybe people start in their personal life before their professional life. I think it's good to practice that disclosure statement and recognize that we're not going to have all the answers, especially with something like long COVID. We don't have the answers for what this is going to look like long term, but it also goes back to living in the present.
Hmm.
Hope for the future that things will change, but be okay with where things are right now and get the accommodations and the support that you need to have the life you have currently.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so moving forward a little bit in this process of like acceptance and understanding what's going on, right? Because a lot of the barriers that long COVID patients face is that they don't really know what's going on with their body. Their doctors don't know what to tell them. We don't know how long COVID is going to last or really what it is, like biologically speaking. So someone asked, how does one know that they are ready to transition back to work or looking for work? And I just want to build on this question a little bit. What I've seen in our support group is that, especially with the CARES Act and the pandemic shutting everything down, it might not be necessarily that they've been on medical leave for months, but so many people lost their jobs as a result of the pandemic. Um, and so, how do you know when you're ready to go back in?
So I think that is going to be individual for every person. But once you are at a point where you feel like you're stable enough to go back to work. So if you're still really sick, that's probably not the time to go back to work. If you're still needing to sleep a lot or you're still adjusting to medications, things like that, that's not the time to probably go back to work. But if you've kind of settled into where you have some sort of predictability, like this is kind of how I've been feeling for a while now, then that's probably an indicator that things have stabilized for you in whatever that new normal looks like. I would also say if you were working full time and then were not working at all, it may be best to kind of gradually transition back to. I would definitely not say don't jump right back into 40 hours a week or 60 hours a week in some jobs. Start with a couple hours a week or a couple hours each day and see how that goes. If your employer is willing to accommodate that, which I would generally say most employers would rather have somebody that's productive half the time than not at all. And so try it out, see how it goes. And then if that goes okay, at a couple hours a day, you can work your way up a little more. I think it's kind of setting yourself up for failure if you jump straight back into expecting it to be like it was before you got sick, because that's just not going to happen. Your body has changed its entire way of functioning. And so you can't expect it to be the way it was before. And if you do, then you're going to be right back into that stage of grief, of anger, because you're going to be angry that it's not the way it was before. So I think it's important to have that understanding that it is not going to be what it was before. It doesn't mean it can't be good and productive and fulfilling. It just isn't going to feel the way it did before. So that's why if you can ease into it and figure out what this new normal looks like, it'll be a lot better in the long run.
So let's say that somebody lost their job and they're looking for new jobs in terms of this like sort of ease up gradual building, not just jumping back into full time. Would it be better for someone to look for a part-time job as a way to transition, or should they look for 40 hours and then try to negotiate accommodations to build back up?
I think it's going to partially depend on the field that you're in and what the expectations are. But yes, if you can either start part time or start where it's partially remote, so that let's say, or like maybe the hours don't have to be between 8 and 5. So let's say for you, maybe your best productivity hours are from like 5 to 9 p.m. Or some people, it's even like 10 to 1 a.m. I know some people that have that burst of energy when the rest of us are going to sleep. But so either look for a job that's part time or has flexible hours. So maybe not a job where you have to be somewhere at a desk from 8 to 5. something that has a little more flexibility to it so that you can work when you are most productive personally.
So it sounds like what you recommend is like not only do you want to plan to ask for accommodations, but also when you're looking for a job, try to find one that has more flexibility built in the first place so that you can kind of combine those two together.
Yes. And so it's going to be important to kind of know again what your new normal is. Like, when are you most productive? Also, when are the harder times of the day for you so that you can go in when you're talking about scheduling or things like that and say, this is when I would prefer to work because this is when I can give you my best self.
So we have a new question that came in that I think is relevant to this. The person said, I'm expecting I'll have a significant gap in my employment timeline. How should that be addressed once I'm able to start looking for work?
Well, I guess luckily is not really the right term, but a lot of people are experiencing a gap in employment right now, not necessarily related to chronic illness. So I think of all the times to have a gap on your resume, now is an okay time to have that. I would not necessarily address it unless the employer asks about it. You can always say that you chose to take some personal time due to the pandemic to meet your responsibilities. There are ways to phrase it so you don't necessarily have to say, I got really sick and that's why I wasn't working during that time period. I think the idea of gaps on our resumes is kind of an old school thing that employers don't pay as much attention to anymore. They're looking at, can you fulfill the need that I have, and not necessarily, especially if you have an education, you have experience in the field, they're not going to care as much about those 6 months where you weren't working as they are about, can you help me fulfill this need that I have now. So it's a highlight that, and I would not even address it unless somebody asks.
And I think um, folks could say, oh, I wasn't working due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And that doesn't imply that you had COVID-19. You don't have to disclose that you had COVID-19. You could just say, do.
Right, because we've seen people leaving the workforce to take care of family or to make up for gaps in childcare, things like that. There are a lot of reasons somebody may not have worked in the last 6 months, not just because they had COVID.
So I want to talk about two more things with our like 15 minutes left. And the first um, is what do you recommend for people who aren't really ready to go back to work? And then the second, I just want to talk briefly about the process of getting accommodations in school.
Okay.
So first, let's talk a little bit about, let's say someone's really not ready to go back to work. Like they haven't stabilized, like you described earlier. Their symptoms are still fluctuating. They're still meeting with doctors quite frequently, maybe getting a lot of testing done. They have a whole list of medications that they need to work through, trying one at a time, seeing how they respond, how their body responds. Um, do you have any advice that you want to give them as far as like navigating um, income and other struggles that they face while they wait to stabilize to go back to work?
Yeah, so that's a hard one because income obviously is necessary. So I would say try to find something that allows you, if you really need an income and you don't maybe have a spouse or significant other that can help fill that gap, then finding something that allows you to work from home, work remotely. I know the Mighty posts articles every once in a while that's like 7 work from home jobs that are available right now. So I'd say you could look into those resources. If it's not as much about having an income, but finding something to do with your time, because I think that's also important. Because if we just sit home all day, every day, focusing on being sick and all the things we can't do anymore, then that's going to put us in a really unhealthy place mentally. So finding some way to still have a reason to wake up in the morning, and even if you can't get out of bed, but a purpose for waking up. And so there's lots of ways that people can do that, get involved with an advocacy organization. There's tons of Facebook support groups out there that are usually looking for moderators. You can do that from your bed on your phone if you need to. Or if you're stable enough that you can get out of the house every once in a while, volunteer at an animal shelter or a homeless shelter, or do something that helps you feel like you're still giving back to other people. Because I think most of us have that innate need to do something purposeful with our lives. or different crisis text lines are always looking for volunteers, and you usually just have to go through a training, and then you can be there for someone else that's struggling. So finding something to do, write a blog, document your experiences, because I know for me, when I was first diagnosed, that's what got me through those really hard times, is looking at other people's stories. And you may think, oh, I don't have anything unique to say, but just the fact that you're putting your story out there is really powerful. You don't have to be a great writer, you don't have to be a great speaker. Record a video, type up a blog, something that helps other people understand that they're not alone, because that's just as powerful as anything else we can do, is knowing that you are not the only one struggling with these things right now. And it may not even be somebody else with long COVID, but someone else who's in a similar situation due to another illness. So find some way to do something that's not necessarily just focused on your current struggle. So find some way to bring in some meaning or purpose and engagement with the outside world.
Yes, I love that. I have talked a lot about in and thought a lot about in my illness, Viktor Frankl's man's approach to meaning, and his idea is basically that having meaning can help humans get through even the most excruciatingly difficult times. Um, so I think that's important. And I also think it's relevant to our conversation here in talking about job transitions, because I've noticed for me, I've had a lot of ups and downs in my illness. I've had more functional times and less functional times. And in my less functional times, I find that when I'm volunteering or doing things like you described, it helps me know when I'm ready or very obviously not ready to return to work.
Right. Yeah, you got to somehow try it out. And in a low stakes environment where you're volunteering is a great way to do that.
Exactly. It's a low pressure. You're not going to get in trouble. You're not going to get fired. You can kind of test it out that way, see how your body does.
Yeah.
So let's just talk briefly about accommodations in school, and then we will wrap up our conversation. Can you talk a little bit about maybe how the process is different for getting accommodations in school, both K-12 and university level?
So K-12, you're going to want to start probably with your school counselor, or find out who your 504 coordinator is, because there's two different ways to get accommodations. One is a 504 plan, which the name comes from the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, if you were wondering where that came from. And that can just be for anybody that needs modifications or accommodations. So I want to explain the difference. So a modification actually modifies the curriculum, whereas an accommodation just reduces barriers to accessing the curriculum. So an accommodation for a test might be that you get extended time to take the test if you struggle with like concentration, things like that. So let's say if everyone else gets an hour, maybe you get 2 hours to take the test, but you're still taking the same test as everyone else. That's an accommodation. Where a modification would be if everyone else was writing an essay test and you took a multiple choice exam. So it actually changes the curriculum or the assessment. So that's kind of the basic difference between a modification and an accommodation. And you can either have a 504 plan or an IEP, an individualized education plan. And it just kind of depends on how significant your needs are and maybe how many other people are involved. Most people are probably going to be okay with the 504 plan. But let's say you need other services like speech language pathology, occupational therapy, physical therapy, things like that, then you're probably going to need an IEP, because you're going to be needing a lot of coordination of services. But usually the first step would be to go to your school counselor. They used to be called guidance counselors, now they're school counselors. So they're going to be a really great resource and are often on those teams. So that would be the first person I would go to if you're in the K through 12 system, would be your school counselor or your special education director, depending on the size of your school or your school district. So that's K through 12.
Um,
Go ahead.
just to interrupt, so let's say we have parents of kids who are in school who have long COVID. Even though we don't know if long COVID is going to be long lasting, can they still seek these services?
Yes, because they're currently experiencing barriers that affect their access to the education system. And that is really all that matters. So we have people that have chronic migraines. They need assistance when they're having a migraine. When they're fine, they don't need help. But we know that multiple chronic illnesses have those ups and downs, relapsing, remitting. And so the only issue is, can you prove that you're having barriers to accessing the education? And as long as you can explain what those barriers are, then you can receive services,
Awesome.
especially for a 504 plan. IEPs are a little more extensive, but they should definitely be qualified for a 504 plan.
Okay. And then can you just talk briefly about accommodations in university level?
Yes. So there is a difference between K through 12 and higher education. So in K through 12, the goal is success. We're basically willing to do whatever it takes to make sure that you graduate with that high school diploma. In higher ed, the goal is access. So we're not going to do whatever it takes to help you get that degree. We're going to do whatever it takes to reduce your barriers to the same education as everyone else. So I like to make that point clear, because a lot of people transition from K through 12 to higher ed and are like, wait, I got all of this stuff in high school, but you're not going to give it to me now. We can't change the curriculum in college. You have to be able to meet the same educational requirements as everyone else. We can't modify the curriculum. I'm using the royal we there, not me personally, but so it is important to recognize that there is a difference between what you're entitled to. So K through 12 is success, higher ed is access. So we're just reducing your barriers to receive the same education as everyone else. So you want to start by going through your disability services office, and they're going to have a variety of names, but if you generally ask for disability services, you'll get to the right place. So at Auburn, we're the Office of Accessibility. At my previous university, it was Center for Educational Access. Something with that title in it is going to get you to what you need. And you will, again, need to be able to tell the person you're meeting with what your barriers to education are. So some typical accommodations in college are going to be extended time for exams, the ability to take an exam in a quiet environment. So it may be a special testing center. Not instead of taking an exam in a hall with 100 people, you're going to go to a quiet environment where there are fewer distractions. It's called a distraction-free testing environment, or reduced distraction testing environment. Having a note taker, so that somebody who's already in your class, you get a copy of their notes, so that you don't have to necessarily try to keep up as much with taking notes, because that can be difficult for some people for a variety of reasons. The ability to audio record your lectures. There's some really great little recorders out there, even pens, smart pens that will, while you write, it records, and then it tells you where you were at the recording while you're writing, so that you can go back and listen to it later, because sometimes we have a hard time absorbing all the information, and professors tend to talk at warp speed sometimes. So it can be hard to pick up on everything. So that way you can go back and listen to the lecture. Digital textbooks, so you don't necessarily have to carry your hardback books around with you to class. And that also, if you have digital textbooks, usually most colleges have a free software program that you can download, and your books will be read out loud to you. So for some people, it can be useful to hear the book while reading it, so that you're getting the source of information from two different sense inputs. The ability to have food or drink in class with you. Sometimes, I'm sure most of us that have been to college have seen the giant signs, no food or drink in this lecture hall. You can have an accommodation so that you can have your water, Gatorade, whatever you need with you in class, to prevent you from getting dehydrated or low blood sugar, or whatever it is that you're struggling with. Breaks, so that you can get up and use the bathroom if you need to, or maybe stand at the back of the classroom, or things like that can help you to stay in the lecture and engaged, but just walk around or stand up if you need to. Those are some that I can think of. Those are some common ones. You'll have to go meet with the disability services office. You will have to disclose your condition to them, but they are not allowed to disclose your specific illness or disability to anybody else. You'll get an accommodations letter every semester that is given to your faculty, and it just says that you have accommodations that need to be followed. Usually they'll require you to meet with your faculty just to go over your accommodations. But again, you are under no obligation to disclose. You can if you choose to, but They're not allowed to announce it to the class that you have accommodations. They're not allowed to ask why you need accommodations. That letter is enough proof legally that you're entitled to accommodations.
That's super helpful. And I just want to ask one more clarifying question that, again, with long COVID patients, we don't know if it's going to be permanent. They might not have a super solid diagnosis, but because they're still experiencing barriers to their education, they could seek these accommodations at university.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we've had there are people that have gotten accommodations due to like mono, let's say, which we know could be a long-term illness, could be 1 semester long. So you may only need accommodations for 1 semester. You do have to request them every semester, but you usually just have to have that meeting once. And then you just, like, I know for my colleges, it's an online system. You just go in and click fall 2021, yes, I need these accommodations, and you click which ones they are, and that triggers your letter getting sent to the faculty.
Wow, that's so efficient.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Julie. This has been such a great conversation. Sorry, Dr. Hill. I knew before
That's okay.
um, this has been such a great conversation, and I think will be such a great resource for long COVID patients. Would you be willing to give out your email address if people have questions? Is that something that you're okay with, or should they talk to their local vocational rehab?
I'm happy to field questions. I may not be able to answer. I would say find somebody locally that can help you, but I'm happy to answer questions via email. Do you want me to say it, or I can put it in the Slack?
We can put it in Slack.
Okay.
People can copy.
Yeah, I'm happy to be a resource as much as I can.
Awesome. And we'll just share some links about how people can find their local vocational rehab, as well as some of the other links that you talked about during this in the Slack, and then we'll copy them over to the YouTube channel.
Okay, sounds great.
Well, thank you so much. It's so good to talk to you, and thanks for helping this cohort of patients. I'm sure they appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really had a good time.
Awesome. Well, I'm gonna attempt to close this live stream, which I have not done before, so we'll see how it goes.
All right, bye.